In week 3 of this course schedule, I spoke to you about managers and their attitudes and their values and what happens to organizations as a consequence of that. This week, I talked to you about the context in which managers manage on a more global stage. So we're not talking now about the organization itself. We're talking about the environment within which managers manage. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to retreat to the corner of your computer. This presentation is one I believe that you should watch perhaps several times, or perhaps just once, but give it a real thorough viewing, because the purpose is that you get an idea of how to make the textbook more accessible. The one thing the presentation does is tell you what the learning objectives are, and these are a reproduction of what appears on the Moodle page for you. So you're looking at what the global environment is, and we're trying to categorize for you why that's important. And I'm going to talk to you about two different types of global environment. Basically, we're saying, what is the world about, and what happens right next to the business in which the manager is managing, and what is happening further afield. And number 3, we're saying, can that be categorized in any way? In other words, is it possible to say that there's a kind of classification that we can do to make it easier to understand, to make it easier to learn and remember, and more importantly, ultimately, to apply? Number 4, I think the longer you spend at university and the older you get, the more you will begin to see precisely how tough the world is and the challenge that it represents for us as individuals and for business organizations. This particular learning objective is reference to that toughness. Finally, there is an American response to the distinctions in national cultures and how that impacts on the way organizations are managed and the way organizations should be managed. I emphasize the fact that it's an American perspective simply because the basis upon which the perspective is prepared is one which is not necessarily translatable to what we have as a context here in Africa, and particularly in South Africa. But it gives you a guideline, kind of a learning ladder for you to understand the basis upon which we can start comparing cultures or nations, countries, if you like, and you can start adding to the world's understanding in time. So if we are to look at what we're doing here, in summary, this entire suite of lessons, and there are 2 in total, is about the fact that every manager in every firm, whether it is your own business, whether it is as an employee in someone else's business, whether it is a public entity or whether it is a civil society or non-profit entity, the point is you need to know what's going on around you. And if you don't, well, you're not going to spot the opportunities. And perhaps equally as importantly, you're not going to spot the threats. So if we are to define what we mean by global environment and global organizations, then you'll find that the book starts talking to you about the fact that big organizations operate in more than one national jurisdiction. In other words, you sell your products in different countries in the world, and you might find that you make your products in different countries of the world as well. So Toyotas are made in Perspectin, for example, for sale in right-hand drive markets across the world. Toyota Perspectin does not make all our Toyotas. We buy most of the Toyotas that we drive in South Africa. We buy them into the country, and we export a lot of Toyotas. Probably easily in excess of 200,000 Toyotas a year are manufactured in Perspectin and exported from there. Toyota is a global organization. But when you're operating in different places at the same time, things become really uncertain and really unpredictable. And that means that when you're looking at opportunities, you're looking for how to put the business on the up. and that might be because there is a need for something. So, for example, the United Kingdom has decided that by the year 2030, it is no longer going to entertain the sale of new internal combustion engine motor cars in the United Kingdom. By internal combustion engine, we're saying petrol and diesel motor cars, but it will allow electric cars. Now, what that represents for anyone manufacturing electric cars is that in Great Britain, Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland, there's a lot of people who are going to be buying electric cars come January 2030 because they're not going to be able to buy anything else. The only petrol engined or diesel engined cars which will be sold after January 2030 in the United Kingdom are going to be secondhand. So that represents an opportunity. But by the same token, there are also threats in that global environment. And threats in the global environment are things like, as I've written, a recession and energy shortages and war and pandemics, which is reference to COVID. Energy shortages means that you can't produce. So any country which has a business which has chosen to operate in South Africa, like Toyota Japan, for example, with its Toyota plant in Perspectum, finds itself having to either shut down its plant for 2 hours at a time or create alternative energy sources independently of the Eskom national grid. And that is a threat because it eats into the profit that you can make out of every Toyota produced and sold from that Perspectum plant. So that is a graph of energy production in South Africa. The energy availability factor, or EAF, talks about the amount of electricity available at any point in time. And for South Africa, what you see over a 20-year period plus is that red line. And the red line has declined from in excess of 90% to around 60% on a good day. If we try and comprehend a basis for classifying opportunities and threats, then we talk about it arising in the environment, but very specifically in two environments: a near one, which we refer to as the task environment, which is the green circle in front of you, and a more remote or broad environment, what we refer to over here as the general environment in the blue ring. That might be a little complex. I'm going to tell you how that illustration from your textbook emerges. Effectively, we're putting at the center of that donut the organization, the firm, and the business. And every business then, businesses that run right next to each other, for example, every business is at the center of that donut. And then we can layer on top of that the task environment or immediate environment, the near environment within which the firm operates. And on top of that, we can layer that which is more remote or further away, the broad or general environment, as your text authors refer to it. That gives rise to that particular picture over there. Now, everything that you see filled in on that picture, in other words, all of these labels, all right, all of these labels are things with which you need to be familiar, because they're going to impact on your understanding of business for the rest of your life. So let's have a look at what we mean by task environment. Effectively, the task environment, most importantly, is about how you get customers. And that is the fundamental one. The general environment, in contrast, is stuff which is broadly impactful on the enterprise, but which is not part of the day-to-day environment like competitors and customers are. So that is something we divide into what is apparent over there, but a little bit disguised as pest factors. P for political, E for economic, S for social, and T for technological. Sometimes that's written as pestel, and the additional E and L on pest becomes ecological, and L for legal. But it's a heck of a lot more difficult in a broad general environment to identify those things because you can never know when they're coming. You sort of know what your customers are going to do because they walk through your door on a day-to-day basis. And your competitors are going to advertise just as you do at the end of the month if you're in a supermarket environment, because they're trying to pull customers to their particular supermarket. The point here is that in South Africa, we did not see the Taxi Council protest coming, and that caused, beyond the actual protest itself, an enormous amount of despair and quite a bit of death and destruction this month, August of 2023. And then a year ago, in April 2022, we had the most horrific floods. And a year before that, we had the most horrific riots. And the year before that, we had the inception of the most horrific global pandemic, possibly for near on 100 years. So those things are very impactful on enterprise. And what we know is that we can divide it up as the pest factors, and we can contemplate how they arise and what might materialize as a consequence. Now, what materializes as a consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the fact that neither Russia nor Ukraine is able to produce and sell the grain products that it used to. And that's because, in the case of the Russians, while they've not had much interference with growing grain, they're finding it difficult to sell because there are so many boycotts across the world of Russian grain imports. In the Ukraine, they're finding it difficult to sell because their fields are being blown up and because they can't get their grain onto ships to sell because the Russians have threatened to blow those ships out of the water. So that is impacting across the world and or has impacts across the world. And it's not what anyone saw coming. And it's only after the fact that you can try and correct for it. So the task environment, that was the little circle around the firm, is about not just customers and competitors, but also suppliers who provide the goods that one purchases. Now, this is a tricky one because you see those suppliers are not necessarily local. And if we look at where South Africa gets its supplies from for its local businesses, we know that we buy machinery, and an enormous amount of that comes from China. In fact, it represents about half of our total machine imports. The Chinese sell that, and our imports are almost a quarter of those imports are machines to make things work. We also buy mineral products and vehicles and chemicals and the like. And we do business with China, Germany, the United States, and probably about a quarter in total with the European Union, which has not been listed there in the stats that I provided for you. Russia, by the way, is, I think, about 2% of our total exports and represents a fairly negligible proportion of our imports. And what we export to Russia is citrus fruit, and what we import from Russia is fertilizer. The other element of that task environment is distributors, so the people who actually move your thing. So if Unilever, for example, is making the toothpaste that you used to brush your teeth this morning, how does Unilever sell that toothpaste? It doesn't sell it to you and I. It sells it to Checkers and Spar and Pick n Pay and Boxer and everyone else, and they sell it to us. And those FMCG stores are distributors which buy from Unilever and provide the goods to you and I. But the more powerful a distributor is, the more it impacts on you and I and where we buy our toothpaste from, because we're attracted to supermarkets not to buy toothpaste. We're attracted to supermarkets to take advantage of the specials, which typically tend to be around food and clothes and the like. And toothpaste is a relatively secondary item. So if a supermarket chain is running good specials on food, then they're also going to be selling most of the toothpaste that month. But customers are also part of that task environment. And what's essential over here is that managers have the ability in every business to read the customer and what the customer wants, and whether the customer is voting with their feet or not. Because if they vote with their feet, they might vote to walk out of the business as opposed to into it. And that becomes absolutely essential to detect. It has to be felt in real time, which is why many firms will, certainly in America, it is the case that in retail environments, your phone location settings are being used to identify in what store you find yourself and what you might actually be looking at inside that store. You stand in front of a display in some American stores for long enough, you'll get a message on your phone that does a bit of a sales pitch to you based upon the goods that you've been staring at and where you've been in the store for a long time. But I did talk about competitors and customers, and we must turn to the competitors. But the issue here is that a big issue for every business, and therefore a big issue for the managers who direct the resources of their business, is the volume of competition there is, and how the firm is then arranged, choreographed to be able to deal with that competition. Absolutely fundamental. If you're dealing with competition, one of the things that managers try and do is establish barriers to entry. In other words, they make it difficult for their competitors to compete with them. And by raising barriers to entry, you make it difficult for competitors to enter into the competitive market space. So a barrier to entry is something which is going to arise in a number of ways. So managers are going to look to try and produce incredibly cheaply, because then it becomes difficult for anyone else to compete. They'll also try and establish brand equity, because once you have brand equity, then there are customers who are going to be loyal to that brand. Creating those barriers to entry is what is going to create a problem. You're elevating a hurdle, a problem for potential competitors. Now, I want you to know about that, simply because the more you know about that and the more you understand, the better. The one thing that wasn't part of that picture, that illustration, is what you see listed on that page, and that is the fact that government regulations can also impede entry. In other words, when governments create laws, they make it difficult for some people to compete. One of the laws that might be created would be a tariff restriction. So if you are a South African producer of chicken, what you want is for the government to raise an impediment, a legal impediment, a tariff barrier to importing cheaper chicken from other places. So while it might be cheaper for South Africans to enjoy their chicken from South America, the South African government has implemented a degree of tariff protection to protect South African chicken producers. And that means that you pay a duty when you import chicken into the country. We've seen chicken wars for decades in this country. At least the last 20 years have been characterized by the most fascinating, 30 years have been characterized by the most fascinating chicken wars. As local producers like Rainbow and Farmer Brown, for example, have sought to have the government, they've lobbied the government to ensure that Pick n Pay, for example, or Checkers can't buy cheaper chicken from South America than what they'd get from Rainbow and Farmer Brown. But for now, I'm going to say that we should pause over there. And when I talk to you again, it is going to be about the second half of this global competitive environment, Lark.